Hello, everyone. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Tabby Chavis as our closing keynote speaker, who will be talking about campus climate as a mental health equity issue, centering the diverse experiences of students of color. Dr. Tabby Chavis is the director of the National Center of Institutional Diversity, Associate Vice President for Research, and a professor of education and professor of psychology at the University of Michigan. A native of Aiken, South Carolina, Dr. Chavis attended the University of Virginia, where she received her bachelor's degree and went on to earn a PhD in community psychology. Following her graduate work, Dr. Chavis entered the University of Michigan as an assistant professor and moved up the ranks to professor. Prior to her directorship of NCID, she served as chair of the Combined Program in Education and Psychology and as Associate Dean of Academic Programs and Initiatives within the Rackham Graduate School at the University of Michigan. She is also a co-founder, co-director, and principal investigator in Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context. Dr. Chavis's expertise and research activities center around social identity development among Black adolescents and young adults, achievement motivation processes among ethnic minority students, including relations among individuals' racial, ethnic, gender, and academic identities, educational transitions in secondary schooling and higher education, and diversity and multicultural climates in secondary and higher education settings and implications for students' academic, social, and psychological adjustment. In collaboration with a number of her graduate student and postdoctoral mentees, she has published extensively in these areas. Welcome, Dr. Chavis.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored to participate in this critical conference and the ongoing work of the Depression Center to support the positive mental health of college students. In this talk, my focus is specifically on college students of color, those from racially minoritized communities, including how their campus context experiences can promote or inhibit their positive mental health development. The mental health of students of color in higher education can be influenced by many factors, many of which were engaged and discussed across prior conference sessions. For many students of color, one critical aspect of campus context is its racial climate. So the game plan for this talk includes establishing some common language and framing around the concept of campus racial climate, especially multiple dimensions of campus racial climate. In doing so, I'll center the experiences and voices of students of color through providing some snapshots of research findings from Michigan-based and national-based studies. And hopefully, the framing and the research examples will prime or stimulate our thinking and actions as we exit the conference sessions today. So that we'll be thinking about, what was familiar, what do we want to learn more about? Hopefully you'll be thinking about how these dimensions of climate show up in the particular spaces in the campus and the connected community around the campus that relate to your roles and positions in higher education. And what strategies could you use from your particular positions, roles, or spaces to help improve students' climate experiences in ways that support their positive well-being and mental health? Why focus on campus racial climate? Well, approaches to supporting students of color and other minoritized students will be incomplete if they don't center issues of context. That is, how campus context impacts students. It's critical that higher education moves away from its tendency to focus on changing students or on providing structures and programs to help students navigate or fit into campus and move toward creating environments that support, affirm, and meet the needs of students of color with diverse identities. Also, experiencing a positive campus racial climate is an important mental health outcome in itself. Organizational and educational research shows that people thrive in both well-being and performance in settings in which they experience being valued for who they are and where they feel their identities align with the values of their settings. As such, the fact that many students of color routinely report experiencing negative campus racial climates represents both an educational and mental health inequality. I'll speak now about the contemporary context of campus racial climate, but start by noting that race has long been salient to the experiences of racially minoritized students of color in higher education. But in addition, there are documented increases in white supremacist activity, propaganda, and hate acts on college campuses and elsewhere in our country since the 2016 presidential election season, certainly since the 2020 presidential election season, spurred on and catalyzed by hate, division, tactics, and policies by our former president and others who followed. In national surveys, in fact, educators reported negative impacts on their institutions' climates in the context of the divisive election season. So even compared to recent years, campuses' racial climates have great potential to impact student adjustment and even more of a critical space for action and intervention. And if we think about the urgencies, our current urgencies around COVID and the racial inequalities that has illuminated, along with the social and racial unrest, with increased attention to the ongoing and longstanding police violence that has happened in our country, that higher education spaces are ripe spaces for both undermining students' well-being if they're not responsive to their needs, or for supporting and providing a space of solace and support for students as they experience our broader social and national context. So what is climate? Campus racial climate, in short, is how a campus does race. It represents current norms of behavior, interactions, and broadly held attitudes on a campus. Scholars often use campus climate as a framework to examine and deepen understanding of campus unrest and issues facing students of color, particularly at predominantly white institutions. But I'll note that all settings have a racial climate, norms, structures for interactions based on the demographic composition of the setting and the values and that are attached to those groups in the setting. Metaphorically, campus climate work is similar to environmental climate work. And in fact, climate theories came out of ecological theory. First, for instance, we investigate indicators of climate. For example, what do we ask what the temperature is like for people? Do they find it warm or chilly? Do they feel they belong or are they excluded? We also look at who is present and absent. We see how people treat each other, and we also look at the organizational structures and resources that are available and that are tied to those experiences of interactions. Then we ask questions about patterns to understand how it got to be that way and what can be changed. And then we develop strategies to work to improve it. What is really important to know is that climate work is not done. The work is always ongoing. Drawing from higher education scholarship, I highlight multiple dimensions of climate. First, I highlight the historical legacy of exclusion and inclusion because this influences all of the other dimensions. One exercise that can help you situate your climate work is to consider the historical legacy at your university. Who were the first from different racial ethnic groups to enroll the students, to graduate, to serve in faculty or staff roles in specific units? What are the times that the institution responded in courageous ways to racism and racial challenges, including internal and external pressures, policies, and events? When did it not respond courageously? The reason that we benefit from tracing the historical timeline is so that we can acknowledge our past, positive and negative, and appraise our progress and setbacks that are a part of the broader cycle of movement and progress. The organizational or structural dimension of climate refers to how resources are allocated at the institution to improve diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how diversity, equity, and inclusion is embedded in the reward structure or mission. An institution or unit may have poor climate because DEI work is not supported or is hoped for as goodwill or volunteerism rather than structurally integrated and supported. Next, we consider compositional diversity because this dimension often shapes the psychological and behavioral climate dimensions. Compositional diversity refers to the physical presence of diverse groups, including underrepresented or minoritized groups. Often institutions are focused on increasing compositional diversity, sometimes at the exclusion of other dimensions, which will always make the work incomplete. And we next consider behavioral climate and psychological climate, each of which can influence one another. Psychological climate refers to what people think of as normative. It captures how people feel such as whether they feel welcome, respected, valued, devalued, or isolated, whether it's normal for the setting to provide a space that makes people feel that way. Behavioral climate refers to how people treat each other, observed interactions between different groups or experiences of negative treatment, such as overt bias or microaggressions. From a positive perspective, this can also refer to setting healthy and inclusive interactions in departments and institutions. Sometimes students' psychological and behavioral climate is influenced by compositional diversity. For instance, being the only one of one's race in a setting may lead to questions of value or feelings of isolation. Being the only one, or having token status, also increases the likelihood of being viewed and treated as a token or group representative, most often in stereotypical ways. I'll focus most today on the compositional, psychological, and behavioral dimensions of climate as experienced by students. These are areas on which we can work through individual and organizational actions to shift and improve norms and behavior. This can help institutions establish a positive culture and reputation where students want to attend them and where they feel a sense of belonging and value because of how they are treated. On the flip side, we can recruit a more diverse student body, but they may fail to thrive because of negative compositional, psychological, and behavioral climates that undermine their well-being and adjustment. In sum, campus climate is a manifestation of a campus's underlying cultural values and beliefs around race. It's what people feel and experience in their day-to-day campus lives. As such, it is more directly malleable than culture. Further, students move through various academic and social settings on their campuses, each which can function as microclimates. While each are a part of the campus, they each can also be a location for immediate change through efforts by campus members who work and operate within those different spaces. And I mention this because this means that each of us who are in particular spaces that directly and indirectly impact students have a role and have a space of influence where we can make real impact, even if the broader campus requires a broader set of collective actions, efforts, and resources. Next, I'll share snapshots from several studies of college students of color from racially minoritized groups. This includes campus-level climate data from here at University of Michigan, and data from several of my research studies with collaborators collected with multi-institutional samples, including from U of M. Different types of data can help inform different climate issues, and importantly, help in planning action steps around those issues. Note, while the data examples shared were based on data collected prior to our current COVID crisis and our new remote and online campus conditions that many of our campuses and students are now experiencing, the themes are still relevant to the daily lives and interactions of students, even under remote or hybrid learning environments or socially distanced living conditions. And these themes will remain relevant as we begin to move back toward fuller engagement on our campus environments. Looking at university level diversity, equity and inclusion, a climate study conducted as a part of the University of Michigan's DEI strategic plans, we can see, for example, that students from historically underrepresented racial groups, Black or African American, Latinx, and Native American students here, followed a similar pattern of feeling less sense of value, belonging, and that they're thriving and growing at U of M. And this pattern was observed among undergraduate and graduate students. An advantage of collecting these data campus-wide is that as the campus proceeds in the numerous developed interventions to improve campus climate as a part of the DEI plan, we can use these data to benchmark change generally, as well as within specific units or on specific parts of campus that may be doing better than others in supporting and improving students' experiences. Other example findings from U of M DEI study work provides evidence of the prevalence of climate challenges for students across multiple social identity groups, illuminating the likelihood of experiencing discrimination based on one's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, first-generation status, and disability. Students of color were significantly more likely to report experiencing discrimination over the past year than were white students. Further, LGBTQ+ students reporting disabilities, and first-generation identified students were more likely to report experiencing discrimination than their heterosexual, non-disabled identified, and non-first-generation peers. And as you know, these groups are not mutually exclusive. Students of color hold multiple identities across these identity categories. As such, some students may be more vulnerable than others to the impacts of a negative racial climate. I also highlight my research on campus climate with terrific collaborators. One project is a collaboration with the Healthy Mind Study here at U of M, led by Daniel Eisenberg, which conducts national surveys of college student mental health. This project is ongoing and to date has yielded data from undergraduate and graduate students from diverse campuses across the country. And this is just a summary of a snapshot of the data characteristics. Other examples include, that I'll share snapshots from today, include 2 National Science Foundation supported studies on campus climate experiences among students of color and implications for academic and psychological adjustment. One project focuses on undergraduates and the other on graduate students, both from the same 5 large Michigan universities, including the University of Michigan. Through collaborations with organizations like Healthy Minds and through these types of studies, we work to share project data that can inform understanding and action around students' climate experiences, illuminating themes that are similar across these different types of data sets and things that may be unique to specific contexts. Data from the Healthy Minds study suggests the prevalence of negative campus climate experiences in the daily lives of students of color across diverse campus types. Here, if we focus on different types of microaggressions or students' reports of insults, incivilities, or biased treatment experienced in their day-to-day campuses based on race, reflecting the behavioral climate dimension. While we focus today on the experience of students of color more broadly, which can include shared experiences, it can also be important to disaggregate research findings for different racial ethnic groups. Doing so allows us to consider possible group variation in the nature of students' racial climate experiences on campus. This variation may be based on the societal images, stereotypes, and historical statuses around different groups. And understanding such variation can support efforts to intervene and positively address the spaces, places, and actors that affect different students' climate experiences. Note, in these analyses, the multiracial group includes students identifying with multiple racial ethnic groups. It's aggregated here in an imperfect way to acknowledge those who chose to identify with multiple racial groups. Our full analysis breaks down this group further, as will be presented a bit later. But here, for instance, we see that offensive jokes and comments are fairly common experiences across groups. The blue is the percentage of students indicating that this never happened over the past academic year. Most students reported such events as occurring a few times per year or a few times a month or more. For this analysis, groups did not differ significantly in reported experiences that happened never a few times a year or a few times a month or more. Rude and disrespectful treatment based on race was also reported as fairly common. In this analysis, African American, Black, and Native American, Native Hawaiian students reported more such treatment than did other groups. Microaggressions related to fear, others acting as if they were intimidated or afraid around you, were reported overall as less common than other types of microaggressions. But in this analysis, they were statistically significant differences in groups, with Black students reporting those experiences as more frequent than by other student groups. Similarly, microaggressions based on intellectual inferiority, being treated as if you were stupid, being talked down to, were reported as more frequent by Black, Latinx, and Native American and Native Hawaiian students compared to other student groups. Again, you can still notice that a significant proportion or a substantial proportion of the students in the sample reported that these experiences happened at least a few times a year and a few times a month. And while people have raised questions about low frequency, if something only happens a few times a year, there's increasing research showing that even infrequent experiences of stigma and devaluation can strongly affect individuals' psychological adjustment, their sense of well-being and belonging in spaces. In fact, it shapes people's behavior such that they avoid spaces in which they experience that treatment. So the low frequency can also be a function of individuals' agentic actions to avoid being treated in those ways. And the downside of avoiding spaces may be that students are avoiding academic spaces where they may be experiencing these things. And in terms of another type of microaggression, kind of invisibility, your ideas being ignored, minimized, or devalued. This was reported as similarly frequent across groups of color, with over half of all groups reporting this as happening at least a few times a year across the past academic year. We also examined climate experiences specifically within students' classrooms. Here, Black and Middle Eastern North African students, MENA students, reported more frequent concerns about being viewed in stereotypical ways in their class settings in which they're a minority than did other student groups. That is, they reported feeling more often that others in their class viewed their opinion as speaking for their whole racial group. Similarly, Black and MENA students also reported that fears of representing their group negatively discouraged their class participation more than other student groups did in this particular sample. But as, again, substantial proportions of students across groups reported these feelings, at least a quarter of students, and for most groups, a third or more. I also note that these patterns held for students across various institutional settings, but not presented here. The demographic makeup, structural features, and cultural features of different campuses and their surrounding communities could influence or intensify some patterns of student experience. Further, as I mentioned, students identifying with more than one racial ethnic group were compared to those identifying with one group. Not surprisingly, in the prior analysis, generally that aggregated multiracial student group either reported fewer overall microaggression experiences or didn't tend to differ significantly from the student groups on the lower end of reporting frequency. While the ability to distinguish students who identify with multiple groups is a positive change from prior academic and institutional research practices, which tended to just exclude them or just aggregate them into other groups of color, from a research and practice perspective, aggregating this very diverse group can be limiting in informing their experience, about their experiences. Many students' experiences are circumscribed by their specific group identities, and some experiences may be similar between multiracial and monoracial identified student peers, and there may be some group differences in their experiences as well. So here I break down the multiracial sample a little bit from the Healthy Mind study. About 70% of the multiracial students identified with a historically underrepresented minoritized group, African American, Black, Latinx, Native American, and Native Hawaiian. And about 30% of the multiracial students identified with groups that were not underrepresented minoritized groups in higher education, Asian American, Asian American, and Middle Eastern, North African, and white. And just so you can see the specific groups that were represented in this sample, the greatest percentage of the multiracial student sample here identified as Latinx and white, then Asian and white, then African American, Black and white, then African American, Black and Latinx. And as you can see, the identified multiracial groups here are listed from the highest to lowest representation in the multiracial sample. When looking at the same types of microaggression experiences, we found a general effect based on multiracial students' identification with the traditionally underrepresented minoritized group, with those who identified with an underrepresented minoritized group reporting more frequent microaggression experiences of fear and suspicion, people acting as if they're afraid or intimidated, being treated as if you were stupid or being talked down to, or fears of representing, and also reported greater fears of representing their group that inhibited their classroom participation. When looking at, there were generally few significant differences across the microaggression experiences for the multiracial subgroups. Two significant differences did emerge. One, those multiracial students identifying with the Black identity or as Native American, Black and Latinx, Black and MENA, Black and Native American Asian, Native American and MENA reported more experiences of others treating them with fear and suspicion. While all groups and individuals within a multiracial group do not have the same experience, this pattern could speak to the pervasive anti-Blackness, as well as to the prevalence of anti-Black and anti-Native American stereotypes, de-emphasizing humanity and emphasizing images and constructions of violence. And these stereotypes may play out for multiracial students identifying with those groups. Similarly, the other significant finding was that multiracial students identifying as Black or Latinx those who were identified as being Black and white, Black and Latinx, Latinx and MENA, Black and Asian, reported more frequently that fears of representing their group negatively discouraged them from participating in class. Again, these patterns may speak to stereotypes of anti-intellectualism that may be impacting multiracial students who identified with these groups. That said, the overall lack of multiracial subgroup differences could be due to factors related to the research design and the nature of the phenomena being examined. That is, the experience of being multiracial within and across groups could vary greatly depending on how students identify and think about their identity groups. In this case, we measured the number of groups individuals identified with, but not whether they identified with a multiracial identity, nor did we assess how much students identified with their groups. Second, multiracial students may be perceived by others in a variety of ways based on students' own identification and expressions, as well as phenotypes that others may associate with their groups, which could impact their experiences. Also, because the cell sizes for some of the multiracial subgroups were very small, then we may not have been able to detect differences, significant differences where they did exist. In any case, while these microaggressions patterns suggest the prevalence of anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous or Native American, and anti-Latinx stereotypes that may cross-cut higher education and society, in studying students of color, as well as monoracially identified students, qualitative methods could also provide distinct insights into the nature of students' different climate experiences in their campus settings and in relation to their specific identities. I'll share examples later that speak to the utility of such approaches. Before that, though, I will share additional data from the Healthy Mind study. This summary of regression analyses with the full study sample, including undergraduate and graduate students, suggests the impacts of behavioral, compositional, and psychological climate dimensions. Here, the solid lines indicate a positive statistical association between variables, and dashed lines indicate a negative statistical association. For instance, here we see that experiencing more frequent microaggressions on campus across the different types that I just presented related to less positive mental health outcomes. That is, more frequent microaggressions related to lower personal flourishing. And this included affect and emotions such as feeling confident and capable and having life purpose and meaning. More frequent microaggressions also related to more depressive symptoms and higher anxiety. Reporting more classroom stereotype concerns, that is, feeling the pressure to represent one's group or having fears of reflecting negatively on one's group related to more depressive symptoms. And experiencing a more positive campus climate, one that is more friendly versus hostile, more welcoming, cooperative, and respectful, related to more personal flourishing, fewer depressive symptoms, and lower anxiety. But also, using the college academic and social identity study data, that was data from the 5 large Michigan universities that I mentioned, and this is an undergraduate sample, we examined underrepresented minoritized racial groups, Black, Latinx, and Native American students' experiences of psychological and behavioral climate dimensions. Here, data are over the first year of college. Behavioral climate included perceptions of equal status or equal treatment across racial groups on campus. Do you observe groups being treated differently? Do certain groups get more privileges than others? And psychological climate included perceptions of the quality of intergroup interactions on campus. Is there support for positive intergroup interactions? Is it encouraged, are intergroup interactions across racial lines encouraged and supported? We found that students experiencing an equitable racial climate, where they felt that certain groups got treated unfairly and received more privileges than others, and low quality intergroup associations, where groups either interact very little or have conflict and tension when they do interact, also reported lower sense of belonging. In this study, our indicator of sense of belonging related to their racial ethnic group, and it was captured with a perceived ethnic threat measure. Here, the threat measure is the degree that students perceive that their racial and cultural backgrounds are incompatible with their college context. Students experiencing more threat reported less academic help seeking when they needed it. So this is help seeking when students said that they needed it, and less help seeking around their personal mental health when they needed it. It's also noteworthy that those who did seek help also evaluated the help as less useful if they had more negative climate perceptions. So experiencing a negative racial climate on campus can undermine the effectiveness of campus support efforts that so many of us work on and invest in to support students. In contrast, when students of color experience a campus climate that affirms their positive connections to their racial identities, it can enhance well-being and college adjustment. This example summarizes analysis of an African-American student sample focusing on their racial identity beliefs. Here, a sense of racial pride or positive affective connections to their racial group and heritage. And we looked at how those beliefs related to their well-being. This measure of well-being captures students' sense of personal mastery, self-acceptance, and connectedness to others. For students who perceive the campus climate to be characterized by unequal status or inequalities in treatment of racial groups on campus, indicated by the blue dashed line, their racial pride was unrelated to well-being. However, for students who perceived more equality in the treatment of racial groups on campus, indicated by the solid line, greater racial pride related to greater well-being. That is, the congruence between students' experienced racial climate and their own positive racial identity beliefs related to greater well-being. Another example shows a similar pattern for students' climate experiences related to intergroup associations on campus. For students who perceive the campus climate as supporting positive intergroup interactions across racial groups, the solid line, greater racial pride related to more positive academic affect. And academic affect included positive feelings and emotions such as excitement, optimism, and confidence that students attach to their academic life. Racial pride was not significantly related to positive affect for students perceiving low quality intergroup interactions on campus. These two examples illustrate the need to recognize and leverage the cultural strengths that students of color bring to their campus environments. By creating environments that affirm and honor students' positive racial identities, we can support positive identity development and positive psychological experience in general and as related to their academic goals. From the quantitative survey data sources and examples that I just shared, we can see the prevalence of negative racial climate experiences among students of color, as well as insights into the systemic impacts of climate on mental health across groups of students, both negative and positive. The qualitative student narratives from our research also provide important insights into what racial climate looks like in the daily lives of students of color, including where, how, and with whom experiences occur, and how these experiences might emerge in similar and different ways across students' academic and social contexts. So now I'll provide a few narrative excerpts from a few of our studies that reflect the compositional, behavioral, and psychological dimensions of climate. Distinguishing these dimensions is not simply an academic exercise. Understanding different types of climate experiences can help us consider the best actions to positively and effectively improve the climate. That is, what underlying problem is reflected in the described climate experience? What actions are implicated by the type of experience reported, and who can or should be involved in those actions? This study component focused primarily on Black and Latinx students, but as you'll see from the examples and as evidence from the quantitative data I shared, some of these experiences may be similar to those experienced by other student of color groups. The examples also reflect experiences of students in predominantly white institutions, although varied in their specific racial compositions. Recall, compositional diversity refers to the number and proportion of various racial, ethnic, and cultural groups on campus. May include trainees, students, faculty, staff in an academic institution. In other words, who's present and who's absent. Recruitment brochures. I don't really know how they define diversity at the school when I'm going into my 4th year of college and I haven't had more than one Black professor, and there's never been more than 3 Black students in any of my classes. I'm usually the only one, and that's uncomfortable. Even though I have Black friends, white friends, and Asian friends, it still feels like diversity is a false advertisement. Like a lot of the pamphlets that I was getting from the school were very diverse. The extent that students' expectations around diversity match their realities on campus can impact their psychological experience. Our work suggests that when there's a mismatch between expectations and the experienced reality, students not only feel negatively, but they actually may come to view the university as deceptive or disingenuous about its diversity values. Few know underrepresented faculty. It concerns me that my department is lacking in faculty diversity. As an African-American student, it would be helpful to have the opportunity to be mentored by an African-American professor in my own department instead of having to search through other departments for a mentor who shares my identity. This student's example speaks to the additional efforts that many students of color in predominantly white settings take on to find formal and informal role models from their own backgrounds. And many faculty and staff of color disproportionately take on the roles of supporting these students on college campuses, and most often in invisible, uncredited, and unrewarded ways. Those two systems of inequality kind of happening at the same time, at the level of the students' access and at the level of the disproportionate work that others feel compelled to do to support students. Behavioral climate. Again, behavioral climate describes the interactions among individuals and groups. In other words, how am I treated here? How are people generally treated here? How do people treat each other? This treatment can include positive behaviors, such as positive cross-racial interactions or mentoring, or negative behaviors, such as overt bias or hate crimes, as well as microaggressions that stereotype and marginalize in people's day-to-day settings. Avoiding eye contact. I feel that professors will often give preferential unconscious treatment to white students. This is particularly noticeable when I, a Black male, am the only person of color in a series of 4 classes, and each of these 4 different professors will never make eye contact with me and also teach to the side of the room where I am not located. I try to befriend other white students and using them as a proxy near me in class so that the teacher will look in my direction and possibly encourage my participation. This example speaks to, first, the student's agency, maybe more than an agency than I would have had at that age, in a situation in which he is rendered invisible. Here, he even took the steps to make extra white friends in order to get the educational instruction he deserves and needs for success. While it is an amazing example of academic resilience and persistence, our work suggests that it can come with negative consequences for psychological outcomes such as sense of belonging, flourishing, and well-being. Microaggression by professor. So when class was dismissed, everyone was walking out and me and this classmate were the only 2 left. And the professor said something like, "Guys, don't do that again." And we're like, "What are you talking about?" He's like, Black person next to Black person. Next time sit next to somebody you don't know. I'm like, we don't know each other. It just like he assumed we were 2 Black students. He didn't assume that all the white people that sat next to each other knew each other. This example illustrates the ways that faculty may bring in preconceived notions of Black students, for instance, as fragile, as resistant to intergroup engagement or integration, and expectations of students of color to make the efforts around diversity rather than himself or other white or non-Black people. The student laughed when recounting this experience, but she also referenced such faculty interactions as not uncommon and that they made her question her sense of value and belonging at her school. Overlooked for mentoring. The faculty itself is comprised of majority male, and my field is considered a male-dominated field. Women are not valued, mentored, and are often overlooked. There's a greater sense of camaraderie between the male faculty and the male students. In my experience, faculty have spoken negatively about immigrant students because they felt that they were teaching them only for them to return to their native countries, which would not benefit the United States, specific professional society, whatsoever. As a Black student, not African American, I am totally overlooked and treated like I don't even exist in the department. This example highlights the intersection of race, gender, and immigrant status, and how treatment based in multiple marginalized identities can contribute uniquely to a sense of isolation. Psychological climate. Recall, psychological climate is individuals' perceived norms. What's normal here, including the nature of intergroup relations, how the institution responds to diversity, views on racial conflict on campus, and attitudes toward people from different backgrounds. This is often expressed in terms of how one is experiencing a sense of belonging, isolation, value, or otherwise. In other words, how do people feel here? What is it like? What is normal, which includes but goes beyond my own specific experiences? Feeling pressure to serve as a model. I feel like in certain situations, you have to be a model and not a person. I feel like an African-American on campus, being an African-American on campus, you have to not only like prove academically that you are worthy, but socially as a person, like a person that people can respect. I would say sometimes I feel as though I have to work harder. Here, the student describes a pervasive feeling of low expectations from others and being judged and evaluated as both a student and person based on their race. And in this case, the student also described being often the only person from his racial ethnic group in his classes, not having other classes with others from his group, which creates and exacerbates these types of feelings. Most of the time, I feel like I'm stereotyped. I feel if I'm taking an exam or even if I'm just sitting in class, I can't focus. I just always feel because I'm Black, people just have they have a perception about you. They have this perception of you and it just gives me so much stress and anxiety. So it's impacted my academics negatively. This student explicitly linked their climate experiences to mental health challenges that undermine their academics. This wasn't always the case with students from the sample, often emphasizing positive things like how well they're doing in class or striving or discounting their negative mental health. I have to keep going. In this case, the student is acknowledging it. For the other students, actually, when we measured their mental health outcomes, we actually found that they reported similarly that these experiences are impacting them when we look at our quantitative measures and the associations between reporting these types of experiences or having these types of isolated feelings and their mental health outcomes such as anxiety, depression symptoms, and thriving. As you might expect, many students described experiences reflecting multiple climate dimensions. Lack of racial diversity can feel exclusionary. As someone who is Latina, it's disconcerting that there are only 2 other graduate students in my department who also identify as Hispanic Latinx. Generally, the majority of the graduate students within my department identify as white, and many students within the department come from families where my parents' siblings are also in academia. Many of my fellow graduate students have parents who have PhDs. Because I come from a different background and have different experiences than most of my peers, the department sometimes feels exclusionary. Lack of racial diversity, compositional climate, contributed to feelings of exclusion, psychological climate. This example also highlights the interconnections of race, social class, first-generation status that may shape some students' climate experiences. Feeling out of place. As an African American, just having that situation where you're the only person who looks a certain way or talks a certain way, it has caused me to feel like I have to be a model in the classroom for people, even though I know that's something that's internalized. I shouldn't need to be the model Black student. Instead, I should just be able to be my name in the classroom. Another example of psychological climate and compositional diversity climate. This example illustrates how a lack of demographic diversity is also an equity issue. Students experiencing token status expend emotional and cognitive resources that students from majority groups who see themselves reflected as a normal part of the classroom don't have to devote. They can be judged as individuals, not as representatives. Finally, the department, both faculty and students, are not very welcoming of students of color. Although the department has quite a few international students, comments have been made about the way they talk and that they are here taking jobs. There's also little faculty diversity within the department. It is dominated by white men and nothing has really been done to recruit more faculty of color. The departmental community is also not very welcoming of female students. They are not treated equally in the department and often treated like outsiders. It is not a very comfortable situation. No real effort is ever made to address these issues. Finally, this student links low racial diversity to how they feel and how people interact. It also highlights issues of race, gender, and nationality that may impact students of color. It also speaks to the challenges and need for intervention at faculty and student levels, addressing low demographic diversity along with an accepted culture of disrespect and devaluing of international students of color, students of color, and women. I provided all of those examples, and none of those examples were from the same person. I have many, many more, and some of them felt overlapping, and that is intentional because what I wanted to give you a sense of is that these are not one student, two students, even if it were, that would be important. But across our projects, and when we are looking at kind of qualitative narratives, we hear these sentiments over and over that these are pervasive and prevalent ways of being and existing in these students' environments. Now, these students also are able to name positive things, quality friendships and connections that they've been able to make. People are agentic and active and able to navigate their environments, but in many cases, not without cost. There probably was not more than a few interviews that we did in this pretty large interview study where students did not become emotional at one point, recounting an experience, describing experiences, even in the context of positive experiences that they were able to describe. Take-home points. The research examples presented here illustrate the prevalence of negative climate experiences among students of color and group similarities and differences in climate experiences. They also illuminate how climate experiences occur in students' day-to-day campus lives and the implications of these experiences for mental well-being and adjustment. As we all move forward following this conference, we might consider these types of questions about what we want to learn about students' campus context experiences. What do we want to learn further? And where these climate dimensions show up in the spaces in which we each operate and work. So I would prompt you to think about, what was familiar about the information or the snapshots of student voice that I provided? What was new? What do you need or want to learn more about? How do these behavioral, psychological, and compositional diversity climate dimensions show up in your campus spaces, the spaces around and proximal to your campuses that students often experience as a part of their campus life? Further, you might consider strategies that you can use or have used in your roles and positions to understand and improve climate. How might thinking about the links between students' climate experiences and mental health shape your strategies and practices? What are things that you could do in your particular role that are research and evidence-based that improve students' positive mental health through positive impacts on the climates of the environments in which they operate and reside? These strategies would ideally include efforts to leverage and affirm students' identities and the many strengths associated with their identities. You also might share examples of victories and challenges in your efforts to improve climate to support students' mental health that you can build on or sustain or encourage others to engage in. Note, I also have data showing how students of color draw on their connections to their racial and cultural identities and their cultural communities to help support their psychological resilience. It's actually what I study most in my program of research. But I didn't include most of that today because I wanted to focus on institutions' accountability for creating psychologically healthy context for students. In other words, while action steps to enhance climate and mental health for students of color should include and leverage the strengths of students' identities, it should not be on these students to survive and thrive by their own efforts only. While we can laud and admire and recognize the academic and psychological adaptation and resilience of many students of color, we must focus first on what they're being asked to be resilient to. As such, I urge us to think about our work on enhancing campus climate as creating a psychologically resilient campus for all of us. Why? Remember, I showed you this. Unfortunately, as we have learned even more in recent months, the challenges of interpersonal and systemic racism, including hateful discourse and acts, are not about to stop tomorrow. Acts of racism and hate will continue in our society and campuses, unfortunately. But cultivating a positive campus racial climate can help reduce the incidence of such events by changing the norms of what is acceptable, sanctioned, condoned, reinforced. And even when negative racist events do occur, positive campus climates can allow students, and all of us, in fact, to find solace, support, and strength so that we can thrive and meet the goals that we've set for ourselves. In other words, a positive campus climate is a resilience resource. For example, our work shows that the negative psychological impacts of personal discrimination for students of color are attenuated if students view the discrimination experience as inconsistent with their general campus climate racial norms. In contrast, cultivating or maintaining negative climates can and will exacerbate the negative impacts of local and national racism on student mental health and well-being. So as we move forward, seek to learn more at conferences like this, read research-based and effective practice resources, connect and share ideas and strategies with colleagues and across academic and student affairs and student support units. Use your professional and informal networks and organizations. Try an evidence-based strategy relevant to your role, position, or unit, and assess the impact and make sure that student perspectives and voices are part of any assessment that you do. And remember, campus climate work is equity work, which means that it's never done. Be ambitious, visionary, persistent, and patient. And the more of us doing the work, the more that it doesn't fall on the shoulders of the few, and the more collective impact that we can have. I'll say thank you for your time and attention, and I want to acknowledge first the student participants in the studies that I provided the snapshots for, as well as the units and the funding supports that I have that supported the projects, as well as the collaborators who also supported the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez. So we have a little tradition in my family when we're watching a movie or an opera or an award show. Oftentimes we'll just sit down in our family room and start clapping, even though we're the only ones clapping. So I would love it to invite all of us to wherever we are in our hundreds of different places watching this. Please give a shout out and some claps to Dr. Chavez for just a wonderful closing keynote. So for those of you who weren't with us at the beginning of yesterday, my name is Todd Sevig, and I'm the director of the Student Counseling Center here at the University of Michigan and one of the co-chairs of this conference. And on behalf of myself and the whole conference planning committee and Stephanie Salazar, the engineer of all of this, we as hosts would like to say thank you for coming, attending, participating, listening, and for engaging and contributing to this effort. We hope that all of us are leaving with a renewed sense of passion, knowledge, awareness, skills, new ideas that we can take to our home institutions and have those ideas flourish. The planning committee, when we were thinking about this conference, which is our 19th now, we chose the focus of dual pandemics, both COVID-19 and a new awareness for some people of systemic racism, of interpersonal racism on our campuses, are both happening at the same time. We can't separate it. It's not like one happens one day and then the other day the other ones happens. They're both happening. And they've both caused, in some ways, an unraveling. Things have started to fall apart. Things have gotten very difficult. And those of us who are psychotherapists actually see the value in that, because that is the window, the opportunity for growth and development. So I hope in some ways that this conference has been a stimulus to continue unraveling some things, and yet at the same time have the hope and the promise of raveling back together in a new way, of creating environments that are healthier, and in Dr. Chavez's words, environments that are resilient. We know that student mental health exists in some sick environments on our campuses nationwide. And we need to attack the culture in order to help student mental health. And we also hope that this conference has been helpful to stitch back and ravel back together all kinds of things throughout all the content of all the programs yesterday and today, as we return to our campuses, hopefully in person, hopefully this fall. To close, I'd like to call back the spirit and the passion of John Graydon, who, again, if you weren't with us at the beginning of yesterday, It was his idea to do this conference 20 years ago. And he said one conference 10 or so years ago that we need all of our voices. And what I would like to add to that is we all return to our day-to-day lives on our colleges and universities, here or afar, that we please use our voices, our literal voices in terms of talking, writing, doing research, our conceptual voices, our loud voices, our angry voices, our compassionate voices, our quiet voices, and our voices filled with tears as a loved one experiences mental illness. And also our voices filled with joys. A voice which once was silenced, but now flourishes. And our voice filled with wisdom. And if at times we don't have the energy to even have a voice, find someone who does and join together. Because our larger collective needs all our voices. And in fact, our success is defined by having all of our voices working together. Thank you so much for all the energy these last 2 days. And thank you, and have a good rest of the evening, and take care.